For every Legion Astartes, there were many metaphorical trials by fire throughout the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy. One legion took this a little bit more literally, as the idea of fire-forged warriors is something of a mantra even today. This legion was one of the smaller ones even before the heresy, and came out of the other side loyal but incredibly close to death, with the number of survivors barely enough to found a full-sized chapter. Nonetheless, they continued to serve despite being continually under strength. Their Primarch was honourable, and perhaps the most human of all the Primarchs, a trait adopted by his sons as they are known to care greatly for Imperial citizens compared to other chapters. Blessed or cursed with seemingly eternal life, he lives on today, and is said to return at the time of their greatest need. His name is Vulkan, and his sons were the 18th Legion Astartes from the volcanic world of Nocturne. Supposedly once known as the Dragon Warriors, they are the Salamanders, and this is their story. My name is Michael for Tactica, Imperialis, and welcome to Legions, a 40k Stories miniseries. The origins of the 18th Legion Astartes are perhaps more mysterious than they should be. They, along with the 6th and 20th Legions, the future Space Wolves and Alpha Legion, were supposedly created in secret isolation from the others, each with a specific purpose beyond simply reconquering the galaxy. With the Space Wolves, this role is perhaps more evident, given the Night of the Wolf and the Burning of Prospero, and the Alpha Legion's secretive nature plays into this as well, but the Salamander's role is less clear. Personally, I believe the 18th may well have been the Legion the Emperor planned to use as the Galactic Guardians post-Crusade, given their tendency to protect human forces more than other Astartes, but I cannot provide any true evidence to support this hypothesis. The first known battle for the nascent 18th, who supposedly gained the moniker of Dragon Warriors for some reason, came in the area once known as the Caucasus against a force called the Ethnarsi. The Battle of the Tempest Galleries, one of the last major battles in the Unification Wars, was one that could well have claimed the entire legion, as the 20,000 strong force was reduced to around 1,000 by the end. Once they'd rebuilt, the 18th were often deployed piecemeal rather than as a cohesive whole, supporting the Crusade and its armies rather than leading it. Quite often, they were attached to the Imperial army as the sole Astartes support, performing compliance actions on conquered worlds perhaps more than taking new ground for the Imperium. The Legion also seemingly developed an unhealthy trend over this time, relating in a way to the Tempest Galleries. They were always willing to lay down their lives to preserve what they had, and retreat was rarely considered as an option. Whilst this valour may have been considered commendable, it became seen as borderline suicidal, and before long, the only worthy victory for the 18th was one won in the face of overwhelming odds. This almost willingness to die, along with the disjointed deployment of their forces, kept the numbers of the 18th below what was considered full strength, and any Imperial army troops deployed with them knew they were in for the fight of their lives. Nonetheless, the honour roll of the 18th Legion was extensive and diverse, having not only fought humans, but also any Xenos raids into Imperial space. They were something of the rapid response force in those instances. It wasn't enough for some, however. Following the battle known as the Manticore Cataclysm, when the 18th refused to fall back and paid dearly for it, the Lord Commander of the 13th Legion, later known as the Ultramarines, was enraged. I assume the 13th had been part of the same war zone, and had thus also suffered for the 18th's choice. Also, this is not Marius Gage, who passed on command to Robert Guilliman. He came later. He even went so far as to say the 18th carried their own destruction within them, implying that the Legion would wipe itself out before too long, just as the 3rd Legion would have been killed by the Blight, were it not for the coming of Fulgrim. It's a slightly more abstract idea, but same in principle. Thankfully for the Legion, and the galaxy, this was not a future that would come to pass, despite their continued survival becoming a matter of open debate at one time. Instead, when the Great Crusade entered what would become the Western Ultima Segmentum, it discovered the planet of Nocturne and the 6th of the Emperor's lost sons, Vulkan. Vulkan, one of the few Primarchs not known to have picked up a title or a nickname, arrived on the world of Nocturne during the Time of Trial, when the almost planet-sized moon Prometheus is in close orbit to Nocturne and wreaks havoc on the environment. He was found and taken in by a blacksmith, and like all Primarchs raised among humans, he became a prodigy. 3 years after his discovery, he was the greatest blacksmith in his settlement, larger than any man, and within a year of that, he was the beacon of hope for the entire planet. Nocturne had long suffered raids from Dark Eldar, to the point where everyone had their own designated hiding spot for when the Xenos came. Vulkan was having none of that, and stood smack bang in the middle of town with naught but his smithing hammers, rallying the rest of his people to him and driving back the Dark Eldar. Word spread fast, and within a few weeks the leaders of each of Nocturne's 7 major cities had promised to follow Vulkan's example. They held a tournament in his honour, to which a stranger appeared and asked only to compete. Vulkan took the stranger at his word, promising that the loser would bend their knee in service to the winner. 8 days later, they were still neck and neck, and the final challenge was to be the killing of a giant salamander. The one with the biggest lizard would be the overall champion. Vulkan performed well, but almost lost his life as the volcano he was climbing erupted. Forced to choose between his own life and his prize, the Primarch was instead saved by the stranger, who cast aside their larger salamander in order to save him. As such, when the two returned to the tournament, Vulkan was declared the victor due to actually having a salamander to present, but in a surprise twist, it was the Primarch who knelt before the stranger. In Vulkan's mind, any who would willingly abandon pride and victory to save the life of another was someone worth serving. At this point, the stranger dropped the facade, revealing himself to be none other than the Emperor of Mankind. Why the Emperor had been so deceptive with Vulkan compared to other Primarchs is unknown, but it certainly did the trick of winning his son's trust. Vulkan would remain by the Emperor's side for many years following his return, learning and fighting alongside his father whilst recruits were drawn from Nocturne. Due to the radiation of the planet reacting to their gene seed, these recruits all bore the jet black skin and red eyes now universal within the descendants of the Legion, and it's assumed Vulkan had undergone a similar transformation as well. However, either due to the relatively low planetary population or some other quirk of genetics or fate, the number of recruits that could be drawn from Nocturne was relatively low, keeping the Legion numbers lower even in the later Great Crusade, but this was a trade Vulkan was happy to make in return for having the ideal people in body and temperament to serve with him. Eventually, this force of new Astartes was around 3,000 strong, and Vulkan was reunited with a large portion of his scattered legion under its Lord Commander, Cassian. When they recognized their Gene Father, the Old Guard knelt before him, but Vulkan bade them stand before taking a knee in turn. They fought for him, but he also fought for them. They were equals. Now united, the Legion was officially named the Salamanders in honor of the creature that had brought Vulkan and the Emperor together. Much of their old heraldry remained, so it's assumed their armour was always green even before the coming of Vulkan, but the new insignia would in fact come from the skull of such a creature that served as Vulkan's right shoulder guard. Now reunited with their Primarch and reinforced from Nocturne, the Salamanders Legion took to the field at the front of the Great Crusade. Their record was impressive, despite their continued lack of numbers compared to some other legions, as their skills meshed well with Vulkan's teaching to bring many empires to ruin. They were similar to the Blood Angels in terms of temperament, calm and rational until their ire was roused, at which time they became nigh unstoppable. But even when their wrath was unleashed, they were disciplined, sure of action, and focused. Vulkan also tried to ensure that the Salamanders remained tied to their home, dividing his force into 7 realms based on the great cities of Nocturne. The Lord Commanders became the protectors of these domains, defending it when it was attacked, and as time passed, the cities began to influence the traditions of the companies as well. This not only helped maintain the humanity of the Salamanders compared to other legions, but it instilled an unbreakable bond of brotherhood between them, and ensured that internal competition only drove them to greater heights as opposed to petty disputes. Further reinforcing this was the lack of hierarchy within the Legion. On the battlefield, there was of course a rigid command structure, but unlike the Ultramarines and others, this did not apply off the field, and every brother was considered an equal. Their combat style actually drew slightly obscure parallels with Mortarian's Death Guard. The 14th were known to use chemical weapons and scour worlds with toxins that left the planet uninhabitable, whereas the 18th's approach to the same task saw barren worlds cleansed in fire that were nonetheless ready for settlement immediately. Assumedly due to their similarities and differences, the Salamanders and Death Guard were almost never deployed together, and it actually came to be that the two Primarchs fell out. It's not stated clearly if Vulkan was on good terms with the other Primarchs, though we know he was not part of Guilliman's dauntless few. He did have a pretty major dispute with Conrad Kurz, following the compliance of Karatan. The genocidal terror tactics of the Night Lords horrified Vulkan, and after an entire city was massacred just to scare the rest, Kurz and Vulkan would have come to blows were it not for the undoubted effectiveness of the strategy. Whilst Vulkan was not present at the Council of Nicaea, he was known to have been a supporter of Psychers within the Legion and Astartes, despite not being psychic himself or having ever experienced Psychers on Nocturne as far as we know. Though, his chief librarian and future knight-errant Humogen was present, assumedly as part of the librarian conclave that spoke there. What Vulkan may have lacked in psychic potential, however, he more than made up for in terms of physical weaponry, to say nothing of his actual skill at arms. He had been a blacksmith back on Nocturne, and this passed on to his legion. The 18th were already skilled in maintaining their weaponry and other war gear, but under the tutelage of Vulkan they became masters of forgecraft, able to create artisan weapons that were beautiful effective and destructive in equal measure. In fact, some would claim that the Terminator armor of the Salamanders was second to none, both in the protection it offered and in its unique nature, as every warrior was permitted to modify his own suit. Perhaps due to their kinship with the Forge, the volcanic nature of Nocturne, or some other quirk of nature, the use of flame weapons became commonplace within the 18th, the unique Terminator force, the Pyro class, being a great example. By the time of the compliance of Istvan, the Salamanders stood a shade under 90,000 strong, and were gathered for resupply on Nocturne when the call to arms was sounded. When word reached them of the outbreak of the Horus Heresy, almost the entire Salamanders Legion travelled to Istvan V with Vulkan at their head. This force is believed to have been 83,000 Marines strong, and they met with the Iron Hands and Raven Guard in order to put down the traitor forces. The Salamanders primarily fought against the Death Guard and the Imperial army during the successful first stage of the invasion, and with the beachhead established, Vulkan wished to fall back and allow the incoming reinforcements to pick up the fight. Corax agreed, but Ferrus Manus refused to take a single step back, and in the end the three Primarchs split up rather than just make up their minds between them. Logic. This left the Iron Hands vulnerable to any counterattacks, but it was the Salamanders and Raven Guard who paid the immediate price as the Alpha Legion, Night Lords, Word Bearers and Iron Warriors revealed their treachery and the Dropsite Massacre began. It appears that the Salamanders were primarily engaged by the Alpha Legion, fighting a retreat until they were almost encircled by the Sons of Alpharius, who then began to fall back. It's presumed that around this time, the Iron Warriors fired nuclear warheads upon Vulkan and his legion, killing the vast majority, including the Primarch, or so everyone thought. Vulkan was in fact a perpetual, able to regenerate from any injury, and he slowly put himself back together from being nuked and was able to fight once the remaining traitors reached him. He was knocked out and taken prisoner by Konrad Kurz, but his sons had fared far worse. Though the first captain of the Legion was able to lead away a group of survivors, in total around 98% of the Salamander's force was dead, leaving only around 1,500 legionaries alive from the initial 83,000. Of course, this crippled the Legion, leaving it pretty much unable to fight in the larger Horus Heresy, though remnant forces were still present as part of the force from Istvan, or as garrisons left in place by Vulkan during the Crusade. We can assume that the force from Istvan eventually came to Imperium Secundus and Macragge, where they discovered the extra quirk in their Primarch's biology. For the record, Vulkan's perpetual nature may or may not have been inherited from the Emperor, but that's a story for another day. Following his revival in Istvan, Vulkan was captured by Konrad Kurz, and the Night Haunter inflicted untold horrors upon his brother. Despite multiple extravagant and bloody murders that he continued to regenerate from, Vulkan's spirit never broke, though it's unknown whether his mental fortitude or just continued survival was the bigger irritant for the Night Lord's Primarch. Eventually, Kurz changed tack, trying to convince Vulkan that they were both naught but monsters and killers, setting him countless mental trials to forcibly shatter his brother's spirit. When these also failed, Kurz set one final gauntlet, an elaborate labyrinth built by Perturabo containing Vulkan's hammer, Dawnbringer, and a lot of his sons' corpses. The two fought within the maze, but Vulkan won and activated the teleporter within the hammer to escape from Kurz, appearing in the upper atmosphere of Macragge before crashing into the planet's surface. It appears that this death had finally done to Vulkan what Kurz could not, made him snap. When he awoke after the Ultramarines and Guilliman recovered his still regenerating body, Vulkan attacked them in a mad rage, his mind completely lost. Before long, Kurz had also made his way to Macragge, having escaped the custody of the Dark Angels, and through a strange link the two Primarchs now shared, Vulkan knew about it. Breaking loose and raiding Guilliman's armory, Vulkan hunted down and fought Night Haunter across half the planet, only stopped by the intervention of John Grammaticus, a human perpetual who was also an agent of the mysterious Cabal. Grammaticus had been charged with bringing a weapon known as the Fulgurite to Kurz, as in a Primarch's hand it would be able to permanently kill Vulkan. However, convinced of another path by Eldrad Ulthran, Grammaticus instead stabbed Vulkan himself. The exact reasons why are unknown, but this had the effect of restoring Vulkan's mind at the cost of Grammaticus's perpetual nature. However, when the psychic explosion from the attack went off, Vulkan did not recover. His body was interred into a stasis casket by the leaders of Imperium Secundus, with the words Unbound Flame engraved upon it, before the Salamanders took their leave and began the long journey home to Nocturne. With a little help from what was believed to be a projection of Magnus the Red, they made it back despite an attempted invasion by a force of Death Guard, and, convinced their lord could live, they began a ritual. A week passed unsuccessfully until First Captain Numian sacrificed his own life in the mighty volcano Mount Deathfire, the largest of them on Nocturne. With his death as the necessary sacrifice for some reason, Vulkan was once again reborn. Vulkan lives. While some remnant Salamander forces harried the traitors throughout the heresy, none are known to have been present for the Battle of Terror. However, the 18th were active in the aftermath, hunting down the retreating traitors as part of the Great Scouring, and we know that they were the ones to finally drive Fabius Baal's twisted experiments into the eye. Vulkan was not stated as being involved in this action. In fact, he doesn't appear in any known combat until his surprise return during the War of the Beast in M32. He was around, however, as he is believed to have opposed Guilliman's Codex Astartes for some reason. No one truly knows why, but it may have simply been due to lack of numbers. When Guilliman approached Vulkan to try and resolve the issue, it appears that some form of deal was struck between the brothers. Whilst the Salamanders reorganized in accordance with the Codex, it is believed that there were no chapters formed from dividing the Legion. Given that theoretically 6,000 Salamanders were alive after Istvan, I'm unsure as to how and why this happened, but it did. Assumedly they took a ton more casualties throughout the heresy and could not resupply due to Nocturne's slow recruitment rate that we mentioned earlier. It is theorized that there have in fact been two successors of the Salamanders founded later, the Storm Giants in M41 and the mutated Black Dragons in the cursed 21st founding, but these are unconfirmed. Perhaps, though, confirming that the Salamanders did not divide due to numbers is their current chapter structure. There's only 7 battle companies, including the veteran and scout companies within the chapter. Though each of the main companies is slightly larger than average at around 120 Marines, this still leaves the Salamanders continually undermanned by at least a full company, but this has not prevented them from a long and decorated service throughout the millennia. Perhaps more interesting, though, is the role of Chapter Master for the Salamanders. The position is always taken by the first captain, but they are only ever seen as a regent, a temporary holder of the title if you will. The reason for this is simple. They believe that Vulkan lives. The Primarch disappeared following the heresy and assumedly the reorganization of the Legion, and he did not resurface again until the War of the Beast. He took overall command of the Imperium's crippled military, even managing to give the High Lords of Terror a shouting down. They were lucky he didn't kill them for incompetence. He then led a crusade to the heart of the Orc forces, the site of the Imperium's last great victory against the Greenskins, Ullanor. Fortunately, he was still a perpetual, despite Grammaticus being forced to sacrifice his own perpetual nature to bring him back, and so he managed to make it all the way to the beast itself. The Orc was believed to be 30 foot tall or more according to some reports, and the other Imperials just fell back, left the Primarch to it. There was no way they could make a difference. The two ended up falling into the power generator of the Gargant/temple they were in, infusing them both with War energy. Vulkan, as ever, refused to die, slamming his new weapon Doom Tremor, it appears he lost Doom Ornbringer during the war, into the beast and killed them both in a titanic explosion. Vulkan has never been heard from again, but being a perpetual, I find it almost impossible to believe that he is in fact truly dead, something his sons also believe. As a result, the position of Chapter Master will be passed to Vulkan upon his return, believed to be when the Salamanders can gather his 9 artifacts. The Primarch wished to see his works destroyed, all of them, but the Master of the Forge Tekel convinced him that they would form some sort of legacy, and so 9 devices were preserved, and then subsequently lost. To date, 5 of the artifacts have been recovered, including the Forge Ship Chalice of Fire and much of the war gear of the current Forge Father Vulkan Hestan, who is tasked with finding the rest. But 4 are still lost with no information on them save their names and the odd riddle hinting at their location and function. When the artifacts are finally gathered, it is said that Vulkan will return, though current events unfolding across the galaxy may just force the 18th Primarch's hand a bit sooner than expected. And so, with the tale of the Salamanders told, let us now explore a few famous individuals within the 18th Legion. The elite of the Salamanders were the Fire Drakes, named after mighty salamanders that the Emperor and Vulkan had hunted on Nocturne all those years ago. Every company maintained a cohort of Fire Drakes, and those who would become Vulkan's Honor Guard, the Pyre Guard, were also drawn from their ranks. These Terminator armoured warriors were often selected for their fiery personalities as well as for their skill at arms, but perhaps surprisingly for the Pyre Guard, none of them were natives of Nocturne. The Pyre Guard were the Old Hands, the Terrans, though why this was the case is slightly unclear. Interestingly, they also developed the black skin and red eyes despite having been Astartes long before Vulkan's coming. Their leader, the first captain of the Legion and Vulkan's equerry, was Artilus Numian. How he came to this position is sadly unknown, but to have made it to be of such a high rank among the Terrans suggests he'll have seen plenty of action, which in the case of the 18th meant a lot of hard-fought wins against the odds. As previously stated, he was responsible for leading a large portion of the surviving Salamanders from Istvan V, though he was eventually separated from them following a run-in with Erebus and the Word-Bearers. Numian had actually met John Grammaticus and was aiding the agent in his search for the Fulgurite, which Erebus also wanted. The Loyalist obviously succeeded, as of course Grammaticus wielded the Fulgurite on Macragge, but Numian was seemingly betrayed by Grammaticus before being shot point blank by the traitors and left for dead. He survived, somehow, and escaped back to his brothers before being recaptured by the Word-Bearers, this time being saved by Aenid Thiel of the Ultramarines before being brought to Macragge around the time of Vulkan's arrival. Numian in fact offered, was told, to take command of the Salamanders Legion after Vulkan was rendered comatose dead by the Fulgurite, but he actually refused, falling instead into a depression and desperation to revive his Primarch. He led the journey back to Nocturne, fighting the Word-Bearers yet again as they travelled through the warp. Salvation this time came from a projection of Magnus the Red. Whether this was the Primarch himself or a splinter of his personality is unclear, as is whether this section was traitor or loyalist. And during their brief conversation, Magnus asked Numian what he was willing to sacrifice to see Vulkan return. As we stated earlier, the answer was, in Numian's mind, everything. Once the small Death Guard invasion had been put down and the rituals appeared to fail, Numian's mind finally snapped. Stripping his armour and weapons and abandoning his rank, the now former First Captain walked willingly into Mount Deathfire, providing the necessary sacrifice for Vulkan's return. It may be that Numian's sacrifice set something of a trend within the Salamanders, but we'll talk about that a little later. Of course, the tradition of walking into a volcano may be older and date back to the Great Crusade, but if it is older, then it makes Numian's choice that bit more symbolic and noteworthy. There are very few other known members of the Pyre Guard from this era, but two stand out: the brothers Leodrak and Scatavar. The two had killed a mighty and ancient fire drake between them, and wore one of its horns each on their armour. They both survived the Dropsite Massacre and followed Numian in their retreat, but both would be killed on the world of Traoris, a world considered holy due to the Emperor having visited it, and which housed the Fulgurite before it was recovered by John Grammaticus. Cassian Vaughn was the Lord Commander of the 18th Legion before the discovery and return of Vulkan. His combat record is sadly undocumented before and after the Primarch's arrival, but it's believed he was the never-take-a-step-back breed of salamander with an honourable streak. When Vulkan did return, Vaughn passed over command willingly and easily, but at some point he was gravely injured fighting against orcs in the Taras division. In honour of his service, I assume, Vulkan constructed for Vaughn a unique dreadnought sarcophagus known as the Dracos Revenant, and following his internment, Cassian Vaughn became Cassian Dracos, probably the toughest dreadnought in the entire Imperium. He remained a master warrior, and on the battlefield none could doubt his mind or skill, but as is apparently common for dreadnoughts, his mind suffered for it. It got so bad that, rather like Bjorn of the Space Wolves would come to be, Dracos was only awakened in case of direst need or for the greatest of battles. Istvan V and the Dropsite Massacre would certainly fit that description, and Dracos was part of the battle along with his brothers. Some say he in fact led the charge of the first wave, though whether this was alongside or separate from Vulkan I cannot be sure, and I've no doubt that he immolated many traitors with his perhaps unique Dreadfire Flamers. However, for a long time it was believed that Dracos died on Istvan V. His armour was burned through, and he went charging into the enemy lines as the Loyalists were encircled. He did not escape, as his body, for want of a better word, was buried before somehow being recovered by the prototype cruiser Ebon Drake. This ship had not been part of the force sent to Istvan, but its captain had followed up after not receiving word from any of the Legion, and along with Dracos, 38 more Salamanders were recovered. It appears that said captain deferred authority back to the former Legion Master, at least for ground combat, and the Ebon Drake arrived in the Coronid Deeps during the traitor invasion of the region. They arrived above the Forge world Mazoa not long before it was invaded, and Dracos joined a Mechanicum force and a cohort of Imperial Fists in resisting the Iron Warriors, Alpha Legion, and their allies. Fortunately, the traitor commander was probably pretty high on the incompetence scale, which in my head runs from 1 to Hermann von Strab. Look him up if you've never heard of him. And he rushed the assault, overcommitting the Iron Warriors. Dracos entered the fray and was able to convince the Iron Warrior leader Marek Draeger to defect back to the side of the Loyalists. The combined Salamander, Iron Warrior and Battle Automata force swept away the Alpha Legion, though the commander escaped with his life. Draeger became a close ally of Dracos, though sadly following the Mazoa campaign we do not know what became of them at all. Not Dracos, not Draga, not even the Ebon Drake. They may have stayed in the Coronid Deeps, along with their new allies, fortifying or defending the region, or they may have left to pick up the hunt for Vulkan. Dracos insisted the Primarch was alive, which of course he was, but he was probably a prisoner of Curse at this point. I do hope the old Dreadnought made it, but the Dracos Revenant and Ebon Drake are unaccounted for today, and so I assume they'll simply be counted now amongst the millions of lost hands from the Horus Heresy. I'm immensely saddened and disappointed to report there are no more details of the Salamanders I can tell you. Usually we'd cover at least 3 tales in full, but other than Numian and Dracos, there are simply no stories my research could find. My hypothesis for this is simple. The Salamanders were hit so damn hard on Istvan V and were reduced to such a small number of warriors, there simply weren't enough leaders or heroes/locations where they were placed to forge stories like their first captain or former legion master. Most saddening, neither of these two are from Nocturne, and so in our customary miscellaneous section, I want to honour those Astartes as best I can. The first is Eumogen, the chief librarian of the Salamanders before the Librarius was disbanded at Nicaea. It's unknown what part he played following this, whether he rejoined the rank and file or was given a high-ranking position as an advisor by Vulkan. We can assume, however, that he was not part of the force sent to Istvan V, as far as we're aware, none of that contingent made it back to Terra. Eumogen instead was eventually recruited into the Knights Errant by Malcador the Sigillite, probably relatively early into the heresy, as he was the one to welcome Ravengard chief librarian Balsar Kuthuri into the Knights. We don't know Eumogen's eventual fate, but as a Psyker and a Knight Errant, he may well have been one of the founders of the Grey Knights chapter, which is something I'm still trying to piece together. Perhaps in Eumogen's place as a Legion officer came Nomus Raitan, one of the Lord Chaplains of the 18th. The chaplain edict that followed Nicaea was embraced by the spiritualist Salamanders, and Raitan had already been part of the Voices of Fire who spread Vulkan's Nocturne-influenced doctrines. Raitan was left behind by Vulkan before Istvan, becoming Nocturne's regent in the Primarch's stead and overseeing recruitment. He was thus critical in the slow rebuild of the Legion and proved a key asset when Numian returned and the Death Guard invaded Nocturne. When word of Istvan reached the Legion, it was Raitan who dispatched the Ebon Drake to lead the search for Vulkan, captained by a fellow chaplain, the zealous and borderline fanatic, Xaiaphas Jur. Jur was in fact recruited from Proximal, a word conquered from the 18th late in the Great Crusade, and was seen as a promising officer despite never actually getting to see combat before the heresy. He was the one who recovered Cassian Dracos, which is about the only thing to calm his borderline madness caused from the failure to find Vulkan. Given the Ebon Drake and Dracos went to Mazoa, we assume that Jur travelled with them and probably died during that campaign because, well, he never showed up again afterwards. Finally, I wish to mention Gravius. Who he was and what he did during the Great Crusade is completely unknown, but his ship was abandoned during the heresy seemingly by all save him. He remained there, assumedly using the suspended animation of the Susan membrane that Space Marines have when he could, and he managed to survive all the way to M41 when he was found by members of the Salamanders' Third Company. However, Gravius demonstrated that the Adeptus Astartes are indeed mortal, as he was incredibly frail by this time, and it was better for his brothers to kill him out of mercy than anything else. It's not a story per se, but it's remarkable nonetheless that a Space Marine is able to live for 10,000 years, as long as the conditions are right. Given its importance for the Legion, and still for the chapter today, I've decided to conclude our look at the Salamanders with a bit of cultural history, something a little bit different. The Salamanders followed something known as the Promethean cult, named, I assume, after the titanic moon of Nocturne that also serves as their fortress monastery. They still do today, though it runs in parallel to the Codex Astartes rather than overruling it. The cult teaches the Salamanders the virtues assumedly extolled by Vulkan: loyalty, self-sacrifice, endurance. But it also tells them that they must be self-reliant where they can. This translates to mean that almost every salamander, often trained as a blacksmith when they were young, can maintain and improve his own equipment, just as the legionaries did millennia ago. They truly are masters of the forge, maybe even more so than the mechanical doctrines of the Iron Hands, as they can do it with their own hands and tools. They don't need a machine to do it. With maintenance in the hand of individual battle brothers, incredible things can be created by the Tech Marines and the other artisans within the chapter, though undoubtedly it will pale before the work of Vulkan. Fire is an important symbol to the Salamanders. In fact, it was the symbol of the Promethean cult itself, symbolizing the duality of creation and destruction. This also applied in a more abstract sense to the anvil and hammer, also commonly used as motifs. If Vulkan is watching his sons, waiting for them to find his artifacts before his return, I have no doubt the Primarch will be incredibly proud of his sons for upholding his tenets and never forgetting perhaps its founding principle, the primacy of humanity. The Salamanders never take a step back, and will often lay down their own lives to protect Imperial Guard or civilian forces where other Astartes would not. They are, to those they have protected at least, the ultimate protectors of humanity, but they're just as dangerous on offense as any other Space Marine, such as their duality, as laid out in the Promethean cult. There are still some quirks in their traditions that are perhaps simply inherited from Nocturne, but that are still a bit odd. If a Salamander is too old or injured to continue fighting, but is not worthy of transference to a Dreadnought sarcophagus because the injuries aren't that bad, they may choose to undertake the Burning Walk. Rather than remain amongst their brothers as a mentor, return to live amongst the populace, or even just stick around as a source of some good stories, they may choose to walk into the vast Pyre Desert, where it is said the sun never sets. There they will live out their days in self-imposed exile, choosing to die in the fires of the desert rather than simply fade away. Additionally, it is tradition that any fallen salamander is returned to Nocturne where possible, so as their bodies may be returned to the world that forged them in the most literal of senses. The dead marine is taken to the Imperium, a vast chamber within Mount Deathfire carved out by Tactica, the master of the forge who convinced Vulkan to spare his artifacts. Once there, they are placed among the ceramite slab and lowered into the lava by their brothers, in a ritual that sees the chain bearers branded with a flame, hammer, and anvil upon their palms. If the Battle Brother cannot be returned to Nocturne, often a field cremation is performed, and this is the tradition that I was comparing to with Numeon's sacrifice. We don't know which came first or whether Numeon set the trend, but it's worth considering. So end the tales of the Salamanders Legion. Honestly, when I began to research Vulkan in the 18th, I was unsure what I'd find, as their tale is perhaps less famous than some others. However, I'm pleased that my investigations uncovered a proud, honourable, and unwavering legion. Dangerously so until they were reforged by their Primarch, mind you. Combine this with their immense fortitude to endure their near annihilation in the Horus Heresy and their continued service today, and to an outside observer it would appear that, quirks of tradition aside, the Salamanders truly embody what it is to be a Space Marine. But for now we must bid farewell to Nocturne and continue our journey, and I have a destination in mind that I've been wanting to visit for a while. From the natural fires of Nocturne, we move to a world that burned in unnatural atomic fire, to look at a group with a fatalistic streak even larger than the 18th Legions before Vulkan. I hope you can join me for that, and for the final third of our Legions mini-series. Thank you all for watching. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.